Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you for being here. As we heard quoted moments ago, when Justice Thomas was in this room, in front of this committee, nearly 32 years ago, he had some observations about his confirmation proceedings. And he described those proceedings as, quote, high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves, to do for themselves, to have different ideas. He then described the consequences for doing those things. Quote, you'll be lynched, destroyed, caricatured by a committee of the U.S. Senate rather than hung from a tree. Now, more than 3 decades later, that observation remains tragically relevant. Today's hearing and the radical left's continued attacks on Justice Thomas and his wife, Ginny, over the last 31 and a half years are part of a sustained, hateful attempt to discredit an honest man and a principled jurist. The left, you see, can't tolerate, it cannot accept the fact that one of our greatest American success stories, that of a humble citizen who rose from poverty in the segregated South to become not only one of the Supreme Court's longest-serving justices, but also one of the most influential jurists our country has ever known, is the story of a black man who happens to be conservative. Now, those leading the charge against Justice Thomas would have us believe that he simply couldn't think for himself, that he can't think for himself, and so his wife and his white friends must tell him what to think. And the truth is, the left simply disagrees with his decisions and with the decisions of our current Supreme Court. And they obviously can't persuade the American people to adopt their radical policies through legislation, so they're attempting to destroy the court's credibility and intimidate the Republican-appointed justices and their families, starting with Justice Thomas. They're making clear that justices who disagree with them will pay a price. And it's a price that the radical left is determined to ensure is very high. This is all just a thuggish shakedown. Nice Supreme Court you've got there, America. Sure would be a shame if something happened to it. And don't just take my word for it. Remember what Senator Chuck Schumer did in 2020, went onto the steps of the Supreme Court, called out specific Supreme Court justices by name, referring to Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh by name, telling them, you've released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you move forward with these awful decisions. Then in August of 2019, 5 Democratic senators, including 4 members of this committee, submitted an amicus brief to the Supreme Court of the United States. An amicus brief in which it leveled a threat, saying, change according to what we demand, or else the court is going to have to be, quote, restructured in order to reduce the influence of politics. Since the leak of the Dobbs draft opinion 1 year ago today, the justices and their families have endured constant protests at their homes, their churches, even their children's schools. There was even an assassination attempt against Justice Kavanaugh. And of course, when I say the justices in this context, I don't mean all of them, I mean the Dobbs majority justices, as only the dissenters in that case have been spared the rage machine's bullying, threats, and intimidation tactics. As Justice Alito recently observed in his comments to the Wall Street Journal, it was the Dobbs leak that made Justice Alito and those of his colleagues who joined in his opinion likely targets of assassination. As Justice Alito explained, quote, it was rational for people to believe that they might be able to stop the decision in Dobbs by killing one of us. Astoundingly, with that conversation fresh in our minds, Democratic senators are now threatening to defund the Supreme Court's requested police protection of the justices and their families unless they adopt specific measures that those senators demand. All these tactics, of course, are meant to harass and intimidate the court, specifically the justices appointed to the court by Republican presidents, and force them to impose the left's radical policy agenda on the American people, not through the legislative process, but by judicial fiat. The left has carefully coordinated these attacks with an increasingly compliant left-wing media. If you read articles from sources like the New York Times, Politico, and outlets like ProPublica, you'd think that the Supreme Court justices appointed by Republican presidents are universally reckless and corrupt, and those nominated by Democrats universally conscientious and virtuous. That bias becomes apparent both in what receives coverage and in what doesn't. One justice appointed by a Democratic president failed to recuse when her husband's law firm had cases before the court. One failed to disclose the sources of her spouse's income. One traveled for free with wealthy friends, including stays at the homes of prominent attorneys whose firms have cases before the Supreme Court. You wouldn't hear any of that from the biased media or congressional Democrats who conveniently point only to Republican-appointed justices when demanding their reforms to the court. Now, I raise these examples not to accuse the court of being systemically corrupt or broken in any way. No, it's neither of those things. Let me just finish my statement, if I could. I raise these things only to point out that Senate Democrats, left-wing advocates, and activists and their publicity outposts in America's mainstream media establishment never tell the complete story about this. And by telling only half the story, they reveal their true purpose, which is not to tell the truth, but to punish their political enemies. We cannot afford to delegitimize and denigrate the court in this way. It must stop. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lee.